Hello everyone, my name is Emily Upton and this is my final master's research project presentation on my project, which was using a flipped classroom model to provide differentiated instruction to gifted learners. So a little bit of background, I am a fourth grade math and science teacher, and I've noticed in my school as well as other schools as I've done research is that elementary classrooms are moving towards an inclusion model. So what that means is that students who have special needs and receive special education services, whether that is having an IEP or being identified as gifted, are receiving services in the general education classroom. So sometimes this can lead to gifted students not receiving as much attention as their peers because they quickly grasp the content and they might not need support in order to be successful. So sometimes they can be overlooked. So as I conducted my literature review, I looked at using a flipped classroom model with gifted students as well as students in math. And while there was a wealth of information about best practices for gifted students, as well as implications of using a flipped classroom model in the general education classroom, there wasn't as much information about using a flipped classroom model specifically with gifted students. So that's what helped me to guide my project. I will say that if you're not familiar, a flipped classroom model is basically having students complete learning on their own through videos, and then the time spent in class is used to work with the teacher or actually practice the skill. So some information that I found about best practices for gifted learners kind of were split into two categories, either gifted students who are pulled out of the general education classroom to receive their services, or an inclusion model where students are actually receiving services in the classroom. So my school kind of does both. Students receive pull-out services for gifted language arts, but for math, they are in a cluster group, and I provide those services in the classroom. So best practices for gifted learners in the pull-out setting, one study that I found focused on a specific third grade gifted pull-out class, and they interviewed the teachers and they observed the students and they kind of looked for what was working and what wasn't. So the students indicated that they most enjoyed long-term projects that dive deeper into content. And the researchers found that challenging work was imperative because gifted students struggle to stay motivated when they're just given busy work. So they definitely want to make sure that as a teacher, you're giving those gifted students that work that challenges them and keeps them engaged. In an inclusion setting, it's really important that gifted students aren't just used as peer tutors or given busy work, like I said. And again, in an inclusion model, they found that project-based learning was most engaging to students, so this kind of went along with both studies. However, teachers that were interviewed in this study that focused on teachers who were providing gifted services to students in an inclusion model stated that there was a lack of resources, funding, materials, and opportunities for collaboration that would allow them to really provide the enrichment that their students needed. So there are lots of benefits of the flipped classroom. One of the main ones is self-paced learning. So students are learning from a video, so they're able to pause it, rewind, rewatch if needed, and that's something that they can't do in a traditional classroom. Flipped classroom models also lend themselves to tiered activities so teachers can differentiate easier, as well as 21st century learning where students are responding in a digital medium. And one study found that the flipped classroom actually improved self-efficacy and reduced math anxiety in students in a middle school and high school classroom. So the research is very mixed regards to flipped classroom impact on student achievement. Some of the studies I read said that standardized assessment were not impacted at all by flipped classroom models. Some said that unit assessments or formative assessments did improve when there was a flipped classroom model, but the research is very mixed. So the problem that I face in my classroom that I'm trying to solve with this project is that the gifted students in my school no longer receive pull-out enrichment services for math due to we are no longer a Title I school, so we lost a lot of staff members last year. So this year I am, as the general education teacher, providing enrichment in math. I completed training through my district to be considered highly qualified so that we can say that my students are certified in math for gifted. But I have 8 students in my classroom that are identified as gifted within that general education setting. So the gifted students in my class received a flipped classroom instruction, and my study focused on the effectiveness of the flipped classroom model when replacing whole group instruction. So a lot of times in a flipped classroom model, students are completing the videos outside of the classroom, and then they are coming into class to practice. And the way that I set up this study is that my students would complete the online learning modules while I was teaching the rest of the class. And then when my students who had done the lesson with me were independently working, I would meet with my gifted students. So my research question was, is a flipped classroom model in which students engage in individual learning online, then meet with a teacher to practice, effective in replacing whole group instruction to guide gifted 4th grade math students to demonstrate mastery of content when compared to mastery of content when students participate in traditional whole group instruction? I find my students are bored in whole group because they already get it, or they're ready to move on to practice and the rest of the class isn't. So I created this website to try to help solve that problem. So my research design, I'm using a quantitative one group pre-test post-test design. So if my gifted students demonstrate growth, then this model is successful. However, this is a weak experimental design because I'm only looking at one group of students. I have the only 8 gifted math students in my whole building in my classroom, so I'm not able to compare them to another group. So since I'm using this study to inform my own teaching practices, it's okay that this is only looking at one group. So the participants in my study were non-random convenience sampling. Like I said, I have the only 8 gifted math students in my 4th grade classroom. Data was collected from pre and post assessments for each standard or each unit that we do in 4th grade math. This was a quantitative approach, and I focused on student growth, not achievement, because many of my students are able to score very well on a pre-assessment before we even learn the content. So this focused on student growth. So I created a website called growyourmathbrain.weebly.com. Feel free to check it out. And basically for each lesson in our unit, there's a video lesson that I found on YouTube, a game or online quiz that allows my students to practice the skill and get immediate feedback if they're doing it correct or incorrect. And then there's an exit ticket or work sample that's part of our math series. We use Envision, so I use the enrichment page that goes with that series and stapled it into a packet, and they would complete the page that correlated with that day's lesson. And then my students took the same pre and post assessment as the rest of my students, and I analyzed these for growth. So my results are currently incomplete, though we've finished all of the units at this point. I'm still compiling my data, but I do have some data to share that I compiled and ran through StatCrunch during my statistics course. So this data is 2 units of math that we completed this year. So based on this data, variable 1 are the pre-assessment scores and variable 2 are the post-assessment scores for these 2 different math units. And so based on this data, there is statistical significance in the student scores, and student scores increased from pre to post test overall. And so since the P score is less than 0.05, then this would be considered statistically significant. So, like I said, I still have results that I need to compile, but this has been a really great experience for my students. I find they're more engaged in class, and since they are growing from pre to post test, it indicates that this has been a successful implementation in my classroom, and that my gifted students have benefited. So as I'm wrapping up my project and plan to graduate in May, I've been reflecting on this whole process, and I found it really enjoyable for me and my students. I completed research as an undergraduate, and I was part of an undergraduate research fellowship, and I love being part of educational research and presenting my findings and attending conferences and things like that. And I think that for my students, since this was solving a problem that they were facing and I was facing in the classroom, this has been really great. I will say that I think it's difficult for general education teachers to participate in research and to create a detailed website like I did because of the time constraints. And I will say that doing this on top of teaching has been a lot. For me, I think that the statistics portion of the research is the most challenging. I'm pretty confident in my abilities as a writer, so the literature review and things like that were pretty easy for me, but doing the statistics portion was a huge learning curve, and that was something that I definitely struggled with a little bit more. So I really enjoyed completing this research, and I'm happy that it was one of the requirements of our master's program. Thanks for watching.